Mastering the art of sourdough is a great way to step up your health game in the baking department. And you can step it up even further by milling your own wheat to make your sourdough starter and add into all of your favorite baked goods. So let's talk about it. Let's do it. Today we are going to make a freshly milled loaf of sourdough artisan bread. Today I'm going to show you how to turn this whole wheat into this delicious sourdough loaf made from wheat, water, and salt. 3 simple ingredients. And the best part is this is truly whole wheat that comes straight from freshly milled grain. And unlike buying flour from the store, you're actually getting all of the nutritional components of the grain by milling it yourself, and you're not sacrificing the texture and flavor of a good homemade sourdough bread. Another one of my favorite benefits of starting with whole wheat is that whole wheat can be stored forever. It can be stored for so long. And when you start baking with whole grain and milling it yourself, it really brings to life stories of history, stories of the Bible. When we read about people storing up grain long term in years of plenty, looking ahead toward years of famine. So whole grain, whole wheat makes an excellent storage food. And if you have ever thought about building up a long-term food supply or a food stash just in case of a natural disaster or just whatever, for whatever reason, whole grain is a great place to start. Like I said, if you have wheat, water, and salt, you can make your daily bread. And this can really go a long way in meeting the nutritional needs of your family and keeping you full. Milling your own grain can seem intimidating, but it's really not a big deal after you purchase your grain mill and source your whole grain. It takes just a minute or two to measure out your grain and then just run it through your mill and you have freshly milled flour. So, it maybe adds a couple of minutes onto your baking routine, and then you can just proceed as usual with your sourdough baking. Or even if you don't do sourdough, you can still use freshly milled flour in place of store-bought flour. But today we are going to make an artisan loaf. So I'm getting everything ready, getting it all measured out, and we will walk through the steps, but we're going to take a quick break before we do that. The benefits of sourdough are endless. I think by now most people are familiar with sourdough, but if you're not, the basic concept is that you ferment flour before you bake with it. So it's kind of like a pre-digestion process. So by the time you eat your sourdough baked goods, they've already been kind of digested. I know I'm oversimplifying this. So it's just a lot easier on your gut and the flavor is just unbelievable. However, there is a lot of work that comes with sourdough. It takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of time. It is time and labor intensive, and it's kind of an art and a science. It takes practice. So if you've been wanting to jump on the sourdough train, but you just don't have time or it seems intimidating, you have to check out Wild Grain. Wild Grain is the first of its kind subscription box for sourdough breads, artisanal pastries, and all kinds of sourdough baked goods, even sourdough pasta. You get to customize a box every month and it ships straight to your door. So you get to enjoy all the benefits and the deliciousness of sourdough without the extra time and work. Wild Grain partners with small bakers and artisanal pastry and pasta makers across the country to bring you really quality, delicious products that are ready in under 25 minutes. So everything comes in a box, frozen, you put it in your freezer, and when you're ready to bake, just pop it in the oven, and in no more than 25 minutes, you will have a delicious sourdough bread or pastry or baked good that is ready to go. When you are customizing your wild grain box, you can pick from their classic options, and they also have vegan and gluten-free options as well. Plus, for every membership, 4 meals are donated to the Greater Boston Food Bank. Right now is a great time to simplify your sourdough routine with wild grain. When you use my code Hopewell at wildgrain.com/Hopewell, you will get $30 off your first box and free croissants for life. And their croissants are absolutely delicious. When we get our wild grain box, this is my kids' favorite item that comes in her box by far, hands down. It is the croissants. I have made croissants before, but if you want to talk about time and labor intensive, that like croissants take the cake. They take a really long time and they're not easy to make. So I just let wild grain do that for me. I will put more details, my link and my discount code Hopewell in the description below the video for you guys. So be sure to check them out. I know you are going to love wild grain just as much as we do. My starter is nice and bubbly. It's ready to go. It peaked earlier this morning, so it started to fall a little bit, but it's still nice and active, ready to bake with. So I'm gonna go ahead and weigh out my starter. When I'm baking sourdough, I've been doing it for long enough to where I don't even have to measure. I can just eyeball it. I know what the dough should look like. I know what it should feel like. I know the consistency that's going to give me a nice tight closed crumb or like a nice light airy open crumb. I know all those things without measuring, without weighing. But I found that when you're first getting started, it can be really helpful not only to measure precisely, but to weigh your ingredients. The weight of your starter will change and affect how much flour you need to get your dough to the right consistency. So if you weigh it, you know you're going to be right on track, whether it's really bubbly and active or, you know, it's fallen down a little bit like mine. So let's go ahead, weigh out our starter, then we'll mill some grain and get our dough going. So you can see here that 255 grams of active starter is about a cup, and that's what I have on my recipe on the blog, is just 1 cup of active sourdough starter. So you're pretty safe either way, whether you want to weigh it and be super precise or you want to measure it out with a measuring cup. Having said all of that, my favorite method for knowing that I have the right ratios of flour to water to salt for my dough is still just going by the look and feel of the dough to make sure I have the right consistency, and I've outlined what the right consistency is at each step of artisan bread making in my detailed blog post, and that is linked in the description of the video, so just tap the more button below the video and you'll see the link for that. My artisan bread recipe calls for 3 cups of flour, which is 360 grams of flour, and the weight of the flour is going to be the same as the weight of the whole grain. So if you just measure out 360 grams of grain and mill it, that's how much flour you need, and that happens to be 1.5 cups of grain. So when you mill your grain and you mill it really fine, which that is what I like to do, I like to mill my grain really fine so it's nice and powdery for bread making. I don't want a coarse, dense loaf. I want a light, fluffy, airy loaf. So I mill it. It looks really powdery and fine like this. And so if you mill 1.5 cups of grain, that will give you 3 cups of flour. So you're going to get, in volume, double the amount of flour as you had grain, but it's going to be the same weight. You can experiment with milling and baking with all kinds of grain, from ancient grains like einkorn and emmer to heritage grains like a hard red wheat and modern grains like this hard white wheat I'm using. My favorite is probably hard red wheat. I am just using the hard white today because it's going to give a white loaf that is most similar to the white artisan loaves that most of us probably started with and are most used to. Once you measure out your water, sourdough starter, and flour, combine the water and starter, just mix it together, and then add your flour and mix it until
it's just combined. You don't want to knead it or over mix it. Just get it to come together and then cover it, step away, and let it rest for about a half an hour. Sourdough bread making is a process, and it can take anywhere from 10 to 12 to 24 hours from start to finish to make a loaf of sourdough artisan bread. But that's not all hands-on time. In fact, very little of that is hands-on time. There's really only maybe 20 to 30 minutes of hands-on time, if that. Most of the time is just in the proofing or letting the dough rise. So what I just did after that initial half-hour rest was I added in my tablespoon of salt. Now, I'm just using my hands to mix that salt in. Once again, I am not kneading this dough. I really like these plastic baker's buckets. I don't always like to work with plastic, but I do think these buckets are helpful because they have straight sides and they're clear, so you can, really see when your dough is rising in this bucket, because it can be difficult to tell if you just use a big bowl, like, has my dough doubled in size? So you can monitor it really closely through the rising or proofing process. So I mixed in my salt here. Now I am going to set my dough aside again for another half an hour. And after that half an hour, I'm going to start my stretch and folds. So you see here, I'm just picking my dough up, stretching it, and folding it over on itself 3 or 4 times. You do this a total of 3 times with a half an hour rest in between each stretch and fold. And throughout those half-hour rest periods, the dough is fermenting and it is proofing. It is rising a little bit. Those stretch and folds, that's what you do in place of kneading. You do not knead artisan bread as you would maybe a sandwich loaf or something like that. You're just using the stretch and fold process to develop the gluten. So you can see here that I just, over the course of an hour and a half, because it's 3 stretch and folds with a half an hour rest in between each one, I am working with my dough here. And in between that, I'm just going about my day, doing whatever I have to do. Once you get familiar with sourdough, it's really easy just to incorporate it into your day. If you're home all day, then, it's just another little task on your list, and it just becomes second nature. So you can see here that my dough has doubled in size because after I did my final stretch and fold, I set my dough here in a warm spot, which for me, I have a proofing box that I use sometimes, but sometimes I'll just put it above my fridge or freezer because it's warm up there. And then I let it finish proofing or rising until it has doubled in size. That can take anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. If it's really cold in your house, it can take even longer. But if you have a good active starter, it shouldn't take longer than 12 hours. I have heard of people saying that it can take up to 24 hours for their dough to double in size. But maybe your starter's a little bit underactive if that's the case. So now I turned my dough out onto my counter, and you can see that it's nice and stretchy and, maybe a little bit sticky to the touch, but it's not even sticking to my counter. It's very easy to work with. If anything, this particular dough that I'm working with might be a little overproofed. I might have let it set just a little too long because it's a little bit stickier than I like. But like I said, I was busy doing things on this day. And as you'll see at the end of the video, it's still going to turn out to be a beautiful loaf. Maybe it didn't rise quite as high as my loaves usually do, but once again, I let it proof just a little bit longer than normal. So I rolled it and shaped it into a nice tight ball of dough like you would if you were making a sandwich loaf, and then turned that into a proofing basket, which if you don't have a specific, proofing basket, you can just use a bowl lined with a towel. You definitely don't need to buy specific tools for making sourdough. You can just use what you have. In fact, I've actually brought my sourdough starter on vacation and just used whatever the Airbnb had to make sourdough, whether that's a crock from a crock pot that I found or in a strainer. So you just make do with what you have when you're learning sourdough. If you end up liking it and you decide to stick with it, then you can get all the sourdough stuff. So I placed that dough in the fridge, and I let my dough do one final cold proof in the fridge I like to let it cold proof in the fridge for at least 12 hours. In fact, I usually just do it overnight. I leave it in the fridge overnight. Sometimes I'll even forget about it, leave it in the fridge for a couple of days before I bake it. Then I score the bread. That's what you saw me doing with the razor there. That's called an expansion score. You want to score your bread. There are many, you can get creative, do lots of designs. You could just do a basic score down the side like I did, which really lets the loaf expand and helps it to rise rather than, staying flat and more dense. So then I bake my loaf covered in a Dutch oven at 450 for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, I uncover it, bake it for another 10 minutes, and that's it. Then it's finished. Now is the most difficult part, in my opinion, of making sourdough bread, and that is when you have an artisan loaf that is fresh out of the oven. Do not cut into it. Not right away. Honestly, not even after an hour. You need to let it fully rest and develop because it's so hot. It's actually still baking on the inside. It's still developing and setting. And if you cut into a hot or even warm loaf of sourdough artisan bread, that is what is going to give you like a gummy texture. And maybe you've tried sourdough and you thought you failed, but maybe you didn't actually fail at baking sourdough. You just cut into it too soon before it was set, and that's why it was gummy. So I actually let this set overnight, and then I'm cutting into it the next day. And I do that a lot. I'll prep my dough one day and then let it cold proof in the fridge overnight, bake it the next day, let it rest for another day, and then cut into it on that third day. And you can see here, this was a really nice loaf. Has a really good semi-open crumb. Like I said, it's maybe not as tall as I would like for my, the ideal sourdough loaf. Like I probably wouldn't photograph this particular loaf for the blog because it did overproof just a little bit, which caused it to be, a little more long and flat than I like, but it still was delicious. All right, that is a wrap for this week. I will see you all next week. I'll link everything I talked about in the description below the video. And don't forget to check out the offer that Wild Grain has for Hopewell Heights subscribers before you go. When you order using my code Hopewell from Wild Grain, you will get $30 off your first order and free croissants for life.